Mysterious Ancient Mariners.
Part 12. Landlubber Legionnaires test out their sea legs. The Roman navy that entered the eastern Mediterranean in 201 BC was a formidable force, albeit a new one. For much of their history, the Romans were landlubbers, farmers, cattle ranchers, and foot soldiers. Beginning about 500 BC, they had marched forth from their original settlement on the banks of the Tiber River, subduing the mountaineers of the Apennines and the peoples of the plains, including Greeks who had colonized southern Italy. Over the next 2 centuries, Rome knit together these confused areas under a system of government, an oligarchical state, popular assemblies, and a hierarchy of magistrates that was dynamic, conscientious, and for its day, democratic. Throughout this period, the strength of Rome lay in its army. The sea belonged to the heirs of Alexander, and especially in the west to the Carthaginians, descendants of the Phoenicians. Even as the Romans had expanded and consolidated their power on land, the one-time Phoenician colony on the North African coast had built a great maritime empire, acquiring ports that stretched from Tangier to Tripoli on the shore of present-day Libya, and establishing garrison outposts in Spain, controlling the silver mines of the hinterland, as well as in Sardinia and western Sicily. For all their aggressive inclinations, the Romans seemed hopelessly ill-equipped to match the maritime might of Carthage. Rome had possessed no navy at all until 311 BC, when 2 10-galley fleets were organized, mainly for the protection of coastal towns from pirates. The first naval operations of the Republic were less than stellar. In 310, one of the little fleets made an amphibious raid to put down a rebellion near Pompeii. The Marines were ignominiously routed and fled back to their ships, and the veteran Roman army had to be called in to subdue the rebels 2 years later. In 282, the galleys sailed down the coast to attack the Greek town of Tarentum, inside the heel of the Italian boot. The fleet was crushed, and again the army had to complete the conquest. For nearly 20 years after this debacle, the little Roman navy rotted away in its sheds, and by 264 BC, the Romans did not have a single serviceable galley. In that year, the conflicting interests of Carthage and Rome reached a flashpoint when the Roman army crossed the Strait of Messina in troop transports and landed on Sicily. For the next 23 years, the two powers would struggle for mastery of the island. Improbably, that conflict, known as the First Punic War, Punicus was the Latin word for Phoenician, was to be fought mostly on the sea. By 260 BC, the Roman armies had swept across Sicily's mountainous terrain, meeting no serious obstacle until they approached the southern shores of the island. Polybius, a Greek historian transplanted to Rome, recorded that while many of the inland towns joined the Romans from dread of their land forces, yet a still larger number of seaboard towns held aloof from them in terror of the Carthaginian fleet. So, in the spring of 260, the Roman Senate issued an astonishing decree. A nation that possessed not a single warship, without any resources for it at all, wrote Polybius, and without ever having entertained an idea of naval war, was called upon to build 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes within 60 days. Quinqueremes were the backbone of the Carthaginian fleet, and with nothing to match them, the senators realized the Romans would be defeated before they began. Rome had no shipwrights capable of carrying out the senators' orders. The Republic had never owned a quinquereme and scarcely a trained oarsman or sailor. However, the Greek cities of southern Italy that had fallen under Roman control were old in the ways of the sea, and it was to them that Rome must now turn. Even these cities had never built a quinquereme, but happenstance provided a prototype. The Carthaginians had recently attacked some Roman troop transports in the Strait of Messina. One of their quinqueremes, wrote Polybius, charged so furiously that it ran aground, and falling into the hands of Romans, served them as a model on which they constructed their whole fleet. These swift, maneuverable ships required expert crews, so Rome did not attempt to duplicate them exactly. By a mixture of intentional design and perhaps some unintentional clumsiness, the shipwrights produced quinqueremes that were slower yet more robust than those of Carthage, a landlubberly fleet of floating infantry carriers built on unseasoned wood. An intensive search for oarsmen now began. The fleet required more than 30,000. The citizens of Rome itself were considered to be above such servitude, but the tough farmers and herdsmen of the Italian interior were not. The legend of Roman galley slaves is merely a legend. The Roman galley's oars were always pulled by free men. In bewildered droves, farm boys were crowded onto makeshift rowing benches set up on land and trained to pull to the chant of the time-beater. While they sweated in unison, the shipbuilders hammered and jointed and caulked the fleet together at such a prodigious rate that in only 2 months' time the huge, awkward armada of 120 ships was complete, and its raw crews were tumbled onto the rowing benches. Cursing, retching, stammering fearful pleas to their country gods, they rowed out for a brief practice on the real sea. The whole miraculous event was accomplished almost before the Carthaginians realized it. In June of 260, this fleet left the Tiber and lumbered down the southwest coast to reassemble at Syracuse in Sicily. And here, as the fleet lay at anchor, some brilliant innovator, no one knows who, produced a revolutionary device for warfare at sea. Pondering the problem of the Carthaginians' superior speed and maneuverability, this anonymous inventor designed what came to be known as a corvus, or raven, a 36-foot-long boarding bridge that dangled threateningly from a tall pole at the prow of each ship. Each of these ravens was suspended by a block and tackle, and could be swiveled sideways from its pole head. At the end of each gangway projected an iron spike. When the tackle was released, the bridge would come crashing down on the enemy from a height of some 20 feet. The raven's iron bill would embed itself in the enemy's deck, holding the galley fast while the Romans stormed over the causeway 2 abreast. In an attack conducted this way, rather than by ramming or with missiles, manpower would be all important. Each Roman galley therefore added 80 crack legionnaires to its normal complement of 40 armed marines. Meanwhile, the Carthaginians, not content simply to protect their towns along Sicily's southern and western shores, were ravaging the island's northern coast with a fleet of 130 war galleys. When their captains sighted the new Roman navy plodding through the Strait of Messina to put a stop to their depredations, they regarded it with amused disdain. Their own fleet was slightly outnumbered. The 120 galleys commissioned by the Roman Senate had been bolstered by 25 more, hastily constructed by some other Italian towns. But the Carthaginian fleet included more quinqueremes, and they were the finest of their day, superbly rowed by veteran oarsmen. The commander of the Carthaginian fleet was a mediocre admiral named Hannibal, not the later, more famous bearer of this popular Carthaginian name. As he watched the enemy come wallowing out to battle off the Sicilian coast near Mylae, Hannibal was overjoyed. The Romans appeared to be offering themselves up for a sacrifice. The ponderous galleys, their blades flailing the water as the green oarsmen tried to keep their unison, their decks jammed with armor-clad infantry, their bows dangling the gawky ravens, presented an outlandish sight. Hannibal was so confident of victory that he did not even bother to form battle order. Like descending pirates, the Carthaginians swept into the Roman fleet, ready to ram and veer away in the time-tested tactics of battle at sea. Commanding the Roman fleet was Consul Caius Duilius, a fighter more accustomed to infantry combat. Determined to turn the contest into a man-to-man battle as soon as possible, Duilius led his galleys head-on to the advancing enemy. As the Carthaginian ships struck, the ravens descended. They thundered onto the enemy decks like giant hands, their grip held sure. The Roman oarsmen quickly backed water to prevent the ravens' iron beaks from being wrenched away. The fleets became a congested mass, ship bound to ship by the ponderous gangways. Showers of javelins and arrows rattled over the decks, and with their 4-foot-long shields held before them like a wall, the Roman marines and legionnaires charged across the wooden bridges. The Carthaginian forces, composed of mercenaries, Libyans, Gauls, and Spaniards under Carthaginian commanders, as was Carthaginian custom, were trained in ship-killing tactics not to fight man-to-man on deck. They gave way in shock and amazement. The Romans, sheathed beneath bronze greaves, breastplates, and helmets, swept onto the Carthaginian decks, their short swords stabbing through the enemy's light armor. Wrote Polybius, some of the Carthaginians were cut down while others surrendered in bewildered terror at the battle in which they found themselves engaged. It was, as he said, exactly like a land fight. Those who did try to fight back were met with an invincible rampart of Roman shields, bossed and bound in iron, behind which the legionary helmets, topped by plumes and feathers, appeared to double the size of the men. When the first wave of the Carthaginian ships withdrew, they had found that they had lost 30 galleys. Even Hannibal's flagship had been boarded and taken. However, the admiral himself had made a daring but ignominious escape in a skiff. More circumspectly now, the Carthaginian quinqueremes reassembled to advance once again. This time, wary of the ravens, they tried to run around the Roman flanks and attack the cumbersome galleys broadside or astern. But Duilius, whose ships now outnumbered the Carthaginians by almost 3-2, had backed up his front with a second line. As the Carthaginians darted in on the first rank, the second row of ships pushed forward with fearsome ravens hovering on their prows. Again, the bridges came crashing down on the Carthaginian decks, and again the Roman soldiers swept across their causeways, hacking down everyone in their path. This time the Carthaginians fled. They left behind 44 ships sunk or captured, with a loss of about 10,000 men. The Romans' loss was unrecorded, but it was certainly far less. Duilius had won his country's first naval victory. He was granted a triumphal procession and a lavish memorial in Rome. He was the first to fit out and train ships and crew, declared the monument, and with these he defeated in battle on the high seas all the Carthaginian ships and their mighty naval personnel. Certainly a novel testimonial for a Roman soldier. The Romans could not follow up their first naval victory by conquering the enemy towns in Sicily, which were heavily fortified and supplied by a reinforced Carthaginian fleet. But shortly afterward, Hannibal, attempting to provision Carthage's outposts on the islands of Sardinia, was surprised in harbor by a Roman fleet that destroyed many of his vessels. His sailors, exasperated by their admiral's bumbling leadership, mutinied and killed him in the customary Carthaginian manner, nailing him to a cross. 4 years later, the Romans decided that they were strong enough now to strike at the very heart of the Carthaginians' empire, their capital on the coast of North Africa. Rome by then had a fleet of 330 quinqueremes. Carthage had rebuilt its navy to about 350. The risk for Rome was huge. Success depended on the Roman navy. Isolated from their homeland by the breadth of the Mediterranean and invading a populous land where no friendly harbor awaited them, the Romans would first have to cripple the Carthaginian fleet. Early that summer, the carefully prepared Roman armada, together with some 80 triremes converted into horse transports, left its home port of Ostia and sailed south to cast anchor near the town of Ecnomus on the southern coast of Sicily. Here the marines on board were buttressed by soldiers who had been occupying the island, raising the fleet's total fighting force to 39,600 men. One morning that summer, probably at sunrise, the Romans embarked and set sail along the coast, heading for the western end of the island before turning south toward Carthage. The Carthaginians were positioned squarely across their path at Heraclea, about 35 miles west of Ecnomus. The Carthaginian commanders, probably warned of the Roman advance by fire signals from observers along the shore, assembled their men and addressed them ardently on the importance of the battle ahead. If they won, their leaders pointed out, the war would be confined to Sicily. But if they lost, they would be thrown back to the North African coast. So they put to sea, wrote Polybius, in full fervor of excited gallantry. The two fleets met on calm waters in the clear light of morning. The Romans, under consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso, moved forward in an enormous wedge formation. At the wedge's point, the consuls sailed side by side in their sixer flagships, while behind them the spearhead of the fleet fanned back into two long battle lines. The rear of the wedge was closed by a line of perhaps 70 quinqueremes. In front of that line, protected on all sides, another line of 80 quinqueremes towed the clumsy and precarious horse transports. The luckless Hannibal had been succeeded by a capable and experienced Carthaginian admiral named Hamilcar. Studying the Roman fleet, he deployed his 350 quinqueremes with rapid expertise. He had immediately realized that the Romans' horse transports lent their fleet a glaring vulnerability, hindering the galleys towing them and, if they were to be protected, slowing the fleet as a whole. Hamilcar plotted his strategy accordingly. He sent a quarter of his fleet to form a left wing along the Sicilian shore. To the right, he dispatched a force of fast quinqueremes under the command of his experienced Captain Hanno. These movements left his center weak as he planned. The Roman fleet, massed in a powerful but inflexible order under the swaying ravens, forged on toward the waiting Carthaginians. Seeing the thin, extended center of the Carthaginian line, the Roman commanders ordered a head-on attack. The Roman galleys at the apex of the wedge, followed by the two lines of ships on either side, charged forward. At once the Carthaginian center retreated, backing water or turning in feigned flight, while the Carthaginian flanks spread out on either side of the Roman wedge. Now was Hamilcar's moment. His plan was to close his flanks in a giant pincer action, crushing the Romans in a deadly embrace. He signaled his captains to move to the attack. Instantly, the Carthaginian center turned to confront its pursuers, and the two wings swept down, encircling the foe. But the aspect of the battle had undergone a critical change in the minutes since Regulus and Vulso had ordered their attack on the Carthaginian center. Whether by blunder or by design, scholars have debated. The Roman galleys towing the transports, together with the protective squadron of quinqueremes at the rear of the wedge, did not follow the leading edge of the Roman fleet in its attack. They lagged behind. So instead of holding to the formation of a solid triangle, the Roman fleet had separated into two elements, a wide gap between them. Hamilcar's enveloping strategy was thus thrown into disarray. The protective squadron of the Roman rear turned seaward to meet Hanno and his Carthaginian right wing. At the same time, the captains towing the Roman transports dropped their hawsers and moved to challenge the attackers coming from the other side. The single battle that had started with one fleet encircling the other became instead three separate battles. Meanwhile, the Roman transports drifted out to sea before a northeasterly wind, their terrified horses stamping and whinnying in the holds. In the separate encounters, the Romans' headlong courage became more important than clever seamanship. The galleys that had cast off their transports rushed towards the shore, where they turned their sterns to the beach and formed a crescent, prows outward like a herd of beasts under attack. Dangling their predatory ravens, they dared the enemy to come on. The Carthaginian center, overpowered by the spearhead of what had been the Roman wedge, was first to give way. Latched to their heavy attackers by the ravens, they were unable to maneuver. Their sailors, too lightly armed to fend off Roman legionnaires swarming across the footbridges, were forced back against the bulwarks, then driven over the side or cut down. Leaving Vulso to mop up the last vessels of the Carthaginian center, Regulus turned his flotilla about and went to the aid of the Roman rear, which was engaging with Hanno's quinqueremes. Regulus came upon Hanno from behind, and the Carthaginian right wing was caught in a vice. Before he was completely surrounded, Hanno, who had the fastest quinqueremes in the Carthaginian fleet, skillfully withdrew the remains of his squadron into the open sea. Once more, the robustness of Rome had been too great for the nimbleness of Carthage on the sea, in contrast to Roman casualties of 24 ships sunk in the battle off Ecnomus. More than 1/4 of the Carthaginian fleet of 350 was lost. 64 were captured by their foe, and more than 30 sent to the bottom. Yet a stunning setback lay in store for the Romans. They wanted to follow up the victory at Ecnomus with a swift pursuit of the enemy fleet as it withdrew towards Africa. But the exhaustion of their rowers and the necessity of refitting for a completely new enterprise, nothing less than the invasion of Africa, required a period of rest. By the time the Roman force arrived in Carthaginian waters, the winter was almost upon them. It was decided to send all but 40 ships of the fleet home and leave the army to prepare the ground for an all-out attack on the city of Carthage in the early summer of 255. Under Regulus, 25,500 men, including about 500 cavalry, took over the Punic coastal town of Aspis, scoured the countryside for winter provisions, and flexed their muscles with raids and patrols, securing enough provisions to last the winter. But for reasons not explained by the ancient chroniclers, Regulus engaged the Carthaginians in early spring, before the Roman fleet had returned to Africa for the climactic combined assault. On the plains before Carthage, the Roman soldiery was shattered by the Carthaginian war elephants and cavalry, which outnumbered Regulus's horsemen 8-1. Regulus had about 500 legionnaires that were captured, and about 2,000 retreated back to Aspis. The rest of the 25,000 were slaughtered.